Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Showverse, and today I have another special guest with me. I have the writer and director of the upcoming feature film Souvenir, which is a story of two friends who uncover a very lingering conspiracy after they discover a dead author's wallet. I have with me David Ketterer Spencer, writer and director. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Noah.
Hey, pleasure's all mine. Thank you for coming on the show with us. Now, first, I'd like to say I've had the privilege of watching Souvenir, and I'd like to say that I, for one, enjoyed it quite a bit and also was deeply shocked by how different this movie presents itself when compared to other movies that I've seen. There is this sense of there's this grounded nature to the story, at least in terms of how the characters interact with one another, but there are moments of hyper realism that definitely I found myself enjoying, especially halfway through the movie, as well as certain moments with Doomsday, which we will get into later. Wait, Doomsday, Doom's Clock? Well, man, my lord. His name is never explicitly stated, so
In the credits, we call him Doomsday.
okay, all right. But first, I'd like to get the obvious question out of the way. Where did this idea for Souvenir come from?
So, um, I found years ago in a used bookstore a page of somebody's diary that they had, for whatever reason, like stuck in the pages of this thing. And it had all these kind of fascinating half details in it. Where like it started writing it in pencil, but then switched to red ink. It was on a stationery from a hotel in Nairobi, Kenya, but the guy was writing about it sounded like a guy writing um about being in Philadelphia. It seemed like he was going through a breakup. It was kind of overwritten in this way that made me think this person is probably an aspiring writer of some kind. Um, and was all you could do was sort of guess at what the situation was that had caused this thing to exist. So I thought it was amazing, but I kind of tucked it away and had no idea what to do with it. That was, maybe 15 years ago. And then a couple years ago, I had started writing the first drafts of the script for this, which was originally based pretty closely on a memory of like a day that I had spent with a friend. And the first couple passes of it were just pretty literal, almost like adaptation of that memory. And it was boring. Like it was an interesting memory to me, but on the page it was not compelling. And so I took the page of this diary and I sort of put it in their path and sort of saw what that would do to the story. And over the next couple of drafts, the diary page turned into the wallet because that was more sort of cinematic and offered a sort of greater range of clues in it. And that's sort of where the story came from.
Oh, really? Sorry, it's just a matter of I've done something similar. I like writing based off certain events in my life, and so every once in a while I kind of like write it verbatim, word for word, or character for character, and then make changes along the way.
Excuse me.
Oh, no, you're fine. Now, before we go further into, certain questions I have about Souvenir, I actually want to take a step back and take a look at your portfolio, at least as a filmmaker, because for the most part, at least for the past decade, you've served more as a second unit director, whether that be a first AD or pickup director. So you worked on It Comes at Night, which that popped up a lot when I was researching you, but some of your other filmography involves shorts that you did a little over a decade ago, and this does classify as your first feature, does it not?
Hmm.
So, can you tell me how this is sort of a loaded question. How does making this movie compare to the shorts you made, which I think includes Game Night and Changeover, in comparison to your experience as a second unit or an assistant director on movies like It Comes at Night and hold on, I think I had it pulled up here as well. Oh yeah, and John in the Hole. Like, how does the experience compare, or better yet, how did your experience on some of these other movies help shape the work that you did on Souvenir?
So it's true. I'm an assistant director by trade. And that's been my bread and butter for a while. And I had gotten into it. I found I had an aptitude for it in film school. And originally it was a thing that was fully subordinate to my career as a director. I chose to pursue that because I thought it would prepare me well for being a director. And it did, but it also kind of has a life of its own now. Like I do still enjoy that. And given how many years directors have between projects, I've been on set so much more than most film directors. And I value that because I love being on set. So, I think mm, the trajectory for me involves still kind of having the assistant director career between feature projects of my own. I mean, like for a lot of directors, that's directing commercials or music videos as their way to pay the bills. And, it becomes the same dynamic either way. So rather than cultivate a skill to direct commercials or music videos, great, if anybody sees Souvenir and is like, I have to get this guy for my brand, absolutely, let's talk. But I'm not going to kind of make a point of that. Um, but how did that prepare me for it? I mean, my whole kind of understanding of how the filmmaking process is shaped by my time as an assistant director and all of the kind of lessons that I've learned, both positive and negative examples. I've gotten to work with a lot of amazing people, and one of the things that's been so striking over the years is how different people's processes are. And it's funny because a set is a set. And you know, I've done, the first feature that I ever AD'd was like a $50,000 feature film. And the highest sort of budget level that I've worked at is I'm in what they call baby majors, which is you sort of just gotten out of the kind of tiered union world, but it's not $100 million. It's like, 15 to $18 million. Um, that's kind of the range that I've covered as an AD. And it's the same dynamics that govern all of those sets. It's just a matter of how experienced are the people you're working with and like how big and how multiplied are the trucks and the amount of stuff that you're using. But it's the same variables and the same sort of sensibilities that govern the process. But as far as the directors are concerned, I mean, It Comes at Night had a very different sort of preparation than After Yang, both A24 films, but directors that are both wonderful guys and very, very talented, and they've both gone on to make great films since. Um, but they just approach it from very different angles, and it gave me a sense of kind of the range of different approaches you could have, and also sort of the way that any of the filmmakers that I've worked with have been able to sort of find themselves painted into corners and how they had to get themselves out and being able to anticipate how to get ahead of those problems. I mean, our shoot for Souvenir was 16 days, which was a thing that intimidated a lot of people on the team, and that, it is a very short shoot for a feature film, but I only ever felt so scared about that because the challenges of how to do the work in that short an interval are very familiar.
Really?
Well, just that, I know what it means. I have an understanding, 16 days is the number of shooting days that we could afford to do, right? Like that was the size of the container that we had. And I knew how to first write to that, to write a script that that could kind of fit within that. And then also kind of as the shoot was coming together, finding that there were things where it's like originally, like there's a rainstorm that happens in the film, and originally we were supposed to see more of it than we do. Um, and it's funny at the beginning of prep, I was like, I'm holding on to the rainstorm. The rainstorm is what I'm going to fight for. And then I saw what doing the rainstorm would cost me for everything else. And I realized, okay, not worth it. And I think I was able to get to those kinds of decisions much more quickly than somebody who hadn't seen so many other directors in the same place.
So a lot of practical choices that you were able to make stemmed from a lot of your time working as, an assistant director, seeing what
Mhm.
choices worked better for the production rather than what worked better for the story.
Well, no, no, no. I think it's not like what works better for the story versus the, I mean, those are the same thing.
Right, 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 right.
It's the realizing that holding on to certain preconceptions about what really mattered to the story when the rubber meets the road, how important are those things compared to what it would cost you, right? Like if I had done the rainstorm, I would have had to cut other scenes that mattered or done them in less time than I wanted to, and then I wouldn't have the performances, or, then I would have had to compromise on something else that would have been a much more harmful kind of compromise. And these things happen at every level, and every director has to do that. I just sort of saw those situations on the horizon and knew the value in making those decisions earlier because it allows you to pivot. I mean, I've seen so many directors hold on to something that like everybody else in the film understands, like we're not going to be able to do X. Um, and I have seen how, but if the director's like holding on to this idea, then everybody else is sort of continuing to operate with the idea that, okay, we've got to do X, even though we know that we can. And then finally, the director sort of recognizes reality. But in the meantime, all these resources, even if that resource is just people's time, have been spent on something else that we were never able to do. And if you make that decision earlier, then people are able to pivot and then you haven't spent as many resources. Now, the thing I was worried about was that this would be a like too much of a governing sort of principle of the film. I mean, like I would that I the basically that I would be so ready to accommodate a practical issue that it would cost the story. But I got ahead of that by just hiring a really, really excellent first AD, a woman I know named Alice Johnson, who's been my second assistant director on a number of projects and who is a wonderful first AD. She was willing to do this, which was great because that meant that I was very quickly able to offload the like, okay, Alice has got it, and shut down the AD part of my brain.
And from a lot of the experience that I've had as well, a very good assistant director knows when to say yes to the director or producer or when to say no. So having that, I don't want to say leadership, but having the, I guess, angel on your shoulder definitely helps lead to a smoother production overall, which is, it's kind of, that's what it sounds like to me. You had that angel on your shoulder. And
Hmm.
what else is really interesting to me is that I've spoken with a lot of directors who work with very tight budgets and who know how to utilize it very well, as well as their time. And what I actually really found quite intriguing was the level of, I don't want to say quality because I feel like that demeans what I'm trying to say, but the scale and scope that you have within the movie. You have a lot of props, a lot of locations, and even like a couple big names that actually are sprinkled throughout. Like you have Janine Garofalo, who pops in, which we will get to that. But I actually wanted to tackle a couple other aspects of the film, such as the props and the locations. There are quite a few locations that are seen throughout the entirety of the film. You have a bookstore, you have several apartments, you have the street. And then with props, you have the watch, you have the wallet, you even have a book and a moldy sandwich, which I'll have to ask about that at some point because that really it looks so good. I'm just like, oh God, did that? But what I would like to know, first, how did you secure your locations, whether that be the multiple apartments, whether that be shooting in public, whether it be the bookstore? How did you secure those? And then we'll get into some of the questions about the props.
So the locations, Um, Came through. Uh, we had this location manager who was actually originally a recommendation from our DP, Arlene Muller, excuse me. Um, Luis is the location manager's name, and he was not he was sort of what we call a super scout. So he wasn't actually on set with us. He didn't do some of the things that location managers do in terms of, locking down contracts and things, but he was very kind of efficient at going through um, different ways that you can find locations like this. Particularly with apartments, I've forgotten the name of these websites, unfortunately. But there's places where people kind of list their spaces for rent. And then a lot of times the initial asking price there will be something that is beyond what you can do, but you can reach out to them and have these conversations. Um, so that was one resource that we had for some of our particularly apartment locations. The bookstore. So the fact that the movie is set largely in it's not named, but they're in a neighborhood called Inwood, which is in the very northernmost part of Manhattan. And that came from a conversation with my producer Chandler Wild, who lives up there and who was really pitching, that this would be a cool place to shoot the movie. And I made fun of him at first because I was like, you just want a short commute, right? Like you just want to be able to walk to work. Um, and that maybe that was part of it, but he's also right that it's an area that the city that looks like New York City, but is not as, one of the things that you need to be really kind of careful of when you're shooting in New York City is how kind of overshot, right? Like people have been making movies in New York City since the beginning of filmmaking. And finding locations there that don't feel like they automatically associate you with Annie Hall or Taxi Driver or any number of romantic comedies is part of the project of shooting there. Um, so we sort of had that, and so what bookstores are there, for example? What bookstores kind of are there? And we walked around and we found our preferred ones. And I have to tip my hat as well here to our production manager Richard D'Angelo, who was the person who like struck a lot of the deals and made it possible. Um, he also had the personal connection to our location for Phidias's apartment, where we end up a couple times. Which, fun fact, is the actual apartment that once belonged to Ralph Ellison, the novelist, the guy who wrote Invisible Man. Yeah.
I,
Um,
okay, all right.
yeah. So you go to you go to that corner. There's a statue at the Riverside and 150th Street, and there's the statue sort of devoted to the Invisible Man, and there's a little quote from the novel, and it says, Ralph Ellison, famous novelist of Invisible Man, and all these others, longtime resident of this building in Riverside Drive, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. And we go in and we scout this place, and we get excited about it, and then as we're leaving, the person who runs it is like, oh, by the way, yeah, like this was that apartment. So that it really is not like thematically connected to the movie in any way, but it is kind of cool.
No, that is hey, that is a fun piece of trivia that you can always add to like either the promotion of the movie or just like it's some fun to talk about.
Hmm.
And it really does seem like you had a good team to help you secure a lot of these locations. You had a great unit production manager, a good location scout, even a producer who, may have pushed you towards shooting in that part. But what I do
Right.
appreciate is you yourself mentioned that, you weren't trying to fall into the tropes of, oh, New York being a character within itself. It's definitely a setting, but your focus on your characters, that that is what I appreciate most because it did definitely feel like New York, but it never felt like New York in a way that, New York feels in like in as you said, Taxi Driver or When Harry Met Sally or Annie Hall. But something that I've also noticed with this film as well, as I mentioned before, is your use of props. You actually do have quite an extensive and detailed collection of props. You have, like I said, the wallet with the Fox logo on it. You have identification, passports. You have the watch. And like I said before, that moldy sandwich, which I gotta say, I'm sorry to fixate on the moldy sandwich, but I know I need to get this out of the way right now because it really did you just really like say, huh, we need a moldy sandwich in a briefcase? Steve, yeah. Can you like just make like a tuna sub and then just don't touch it for like a week so we can like put this in the movie? Weird request, but I can do that. Like just tell me how you got that done because it
It
looked
is a
genuinely gross.
it is a prop. It is made out of foam and paint, and it is fully just like a scenic, non-organic thing. But it is convincing looking enough that when we shot the scene where it comes out, the actors were sufficiently disgusted that I had to reassure them that it was not actual. Like they thought that it like we did. It was in a rehearsal where the first time they saw it, and they really thought that I had put an actual. And I was like, no, guys, I'm not going to do that to you or everybody else. Like we're shooting in an apartment. Like I'm not going to put that kind of stank in here.
It's
But
like
it's a really our prop master Kevin got the help of a scenic artist who was not on the film full time, but it was just like a contact of his and had him really go to town on this thing. It looks disgusting. So
it really
I'm glad
does.
it had the intended effect.
Yeah, because like there's I won't to those watching, I will not say when the scene happens, but there is a scene between two characters who open up a briefcase and a disgustingly convincing moldy sandwich appears, and you just look at it and you're like, oh, come on, what like what the fuck, dude? No. But moving away from the funny moldy sandwich, there is an extensive amount of props used in this movie, and a lot of them are very much convincing and are also hyper detailed. I mean, like I said, you have ID, you have a passport, you have a rather expensive looking watch. How are you able to secure a lot of these items or even get them made? Because, some of these are hyper specific.
So it was I I hired my production designer when I was looking at production designers. I wanted people that had a props background, people who kind of come into that role will tend to come up either from like a set decoration background, which means that they're building the environments, but not necessarily individual props, or sometimes they come up through the props department. And I wanted somebody who had come up through the props department because I knew that in the script we had not just one, but a few different items. It's a very kind of proppy movie. I mean, it's about people who find a wallet, and the wallet contains a lot of items, and these things are all what kind of move the story in certain directions. And so I knew I needed somebody who was good at that and could really make convincing looking props that felt like they had a lot of story to them and had a lot of texture. It's also just like a thing I love in movies is like a really well done, really specific prop. Um, it's Tarantino is actually one of the people who's the best at like prop like humor. And it's funny because he's mostly celebrated for much more kind of ostentatious parts of his style, but I think that's actually really one of the things to admire. He's really great at props. But anyway, Sam Schaffner is the production designer on the film, and she had this props background. And her role as a production designer is largely to create these environments, but because we were a small film and our prop master Kevin Cabello, who's also wonderful, but he could only come on at a certain point. So she did a lot of the initial sort of finding and creation of the props themselves. So the wallet, for example, like she has a lot of guys. Production designers are very resourceful people, and it's like you got a guy for things. So like, we talked about how like the fox needing to be embroidered onto the wallet. She's like, I know somebody who can embroider leather. So like she went on eBay and gave me a bunch of options of different wallets, and we talked about what it needed to be, and we picked one. And then she had the people in her network who could do that work. My favorite my favorite prop, and there's a lot of wonderful props in it, but my favorite prop in it is actually the briefcase itself. And I'm trying to think how to have this conversation in a spoiler-free way. But it's important to the story that the briefcase have a combination lock with 4 digits. And when I was pulling references for Sam for the briefcase about what it should look like, I discovered that that does not exist. There is no such thing as a briefcase with a 4 digit combination. They're all three. And that's a weirdly consistent thing. And I tried to sort of write my way around the problem, and um, it none of that really worked. And so, but Sam has her people and was able to hire people to fabricate like a 4 number combination lock on this so that they didn't fabricate the whole briefcase, but they did fabricate the lock. And it was that's it's a thing. I also just think it's the texture of it is so great. And there's like a fabric lining on the inside that's an homage to one of our reference films. So the briefcase is a personal favorite. But the quality of the props and the kind of storiedness of them is owed to Sam and Kevin, who really did a wonderful job.
No, they really did. And, and as you said, props to a film are sometimes very, very important. In fact, you even mentioned Tarantino as a sort of quasi-inspiration towards how props are used. But I also would like to bring up and bring praise to your characters, specifically our two leads, Danny and Kevin. Now, first off, Danny, who's played by Ruby Cruz, and Eric, who's played by Eric Berryman. Is that correct?
Kevin is played by Eric Berryman, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And their performances feel deeply real throughout the entirety of the film. So, especially, I like to draw praise to Ruby's Danny, who feels all too much like someone that we have known at some point in our lives. And a lot of this film is built upon their relationship, specifically their chemistry as old friends. So, what I'm wondering is, and this is another kind of like multi-layered question. One, did you write a detailed background for them and kind of like say, hey, this is what happened throughout their life? Or B, did you at some point, you know, do rehearsals and have them figure it out themselves? Or C, was this more along the lines of you trusted your actors and you just let them go for it?
So all of those all of those things were part of how we created those characters. I mean, we were one of the things we were very lucky with was we had 2 weeks of rehearsal before we started shooting with Ruby and Eric, which for a film of this size, it is really unusual to get that much rehearsal time with your leads. But through a combination of, just we knew this was important, so we budgeted for it. And then in addition to that, Ruby and Eric uh, are both very devoted. Like they really like the script and they really wanted to do right by these characters, and so they really wanted to give their time to rehearse this, and we had a great time with those rehearsals. Um and and sort of there were a number of times in those rehearsals we would talk about sort of what their backstory had been, and I think that there's a lot of stuff that an actor does not need to say in order to sort of feel like their character is lived in, decisions that they make for themselves to bring personal resonance to different aspects of the character. But I do think it's important that even things that aren't explicitly mentioned in the script, that we sort of agree on what those are, right? In the way that these two people would. Like there's this There's this kind of question and answer game that they play throughout the film that we never lay out what the rules are in the script as far as, how this game is played. It's sort of there to understand as much as you, the viewer, care to. But Eric and Ruby and I had to agree on exactly what that game was, how it was played, how they came up with it, kind of what their history with it was. So those were all in conversations. On the writing phase, something I did that I found extremely helpful, and I don't, I'll be curious to see if it becomes useful in a future project that isn't as much of a hangout film as this. But from the beginning, right, this movie, there is a plot and there is a mystery, but you're spending all of it really with these two people. And so it has to be fun to hang out with these two people for 90 minutes or the movie doesn't succeed. And I've always found on the writing level that the practice of writing a sort of Wikipedia page for your character, right? Where they were born, how they grew up, where they went to school, what motivated them to do that. It can be useful to have that, but I find it very dull to write that. And because it's dull to write it, it doesn't really activate my imagination. So what I did in order to sort of like investigate who these people are is there was a New York Times article that was very widely circulated that came out maybe a decade ago, maybe not quite, called To Fall in Love, Do This. And it's 36 questions. And the conceit is if two people sit down and ask each other these questions, by the end of it, they'll be in love with each other. Whether or not that's true, right? Whatever the merit of that conceit is, which seems almost designed to be, I mean, it's the New York Times, but it seems designed to be clickbait. But 36 really good questions. And so I sat down, I had my characters face each other, and I didn't know them yet, right? Like I knew some things about them. I had written a draft of it, but like I didn't really know who Kevin and Danny were. And so in order to create their biographies, I just had Kevin and Danny ask each other these questions and wrote down their answers there. And I found that to be a much richer way to kind of pull out ideas for their backstory because it didn't have to proceed chronologically. I mean, like if you meet someone at a party, if you find interesting things in their past, it's not going to be because they start with where they were born, right? And that's not really how we get interested in people. So I found this to be a really useful tool in creating their past and their personalities.
Which, I give praise to because, as I mentioned, these do feel like very real, very fleshed out people. And not to beat a dead horse here, but Ruby in particular, who plays Danny, there's just something about her that, I think a lot of us knew a Danny at some point in our lives. So it definitely was something I grew attached to. But what's very interesting about Kevin as a character is that we don't necessarily just see him in one form. Without giving too much away, there is some minor flash forwards and flashbacks that involve two versions of the same character. We have an older version of Kevin played brilliantly by Willie C. Carpenter, right? Is that his,
Yeah.
his
Yep.
name?
Mhm.
So, he also plays Doomsday a bit throughout the movie, and we'll get to a little bit of that. But when it came to casting older Kevin, was this more like a, chicken or the egg sort of situation, or was it just you casted younger Kevin and then you searched for an actor to play older Kevin?
It definitely was like find Kevin first and then find an actor who could play the old version of that character. Um, because we do see old Kevin, but it's in, like 2% of the movie. And so I didn't want to feel like I in any way had to compromise or force a decision on who our main character was going to be based on, this version of him that we see. But all that said, it's a thing that I was quite nervous about because old Kevin opens the film and he opens the film by himself. Um, and I I should mention, because we're talking about the actors. We should mention our casting director, Tara Rubin, who was amazing and such a good guide when we were finding the cast for the film. But we had cast Eric, so we knew what Kevin looked like. So how we found old Kevin, obviously somebody who we can believe is what that guy would look like in 50 years. That obviously is one qualifying thing, but it can't be the only like we can't only cast it to what looks right because we also need an actor who's capable of carrying the opening of the film. And the opening of the film does, there's some it's kind of jokey the way the film starts. So we needed somebody who had the comic timing and could play that well. And there were actors who read for the part who did look more precisely like Eric might in 50 years. But the Willie had the kind of meeting point of somebody who looked like he could be that, but also could like do this scene well. But it was definitely like it's definitely a risky thing that the film does that we open with a scene that's very different tonally from everything else. Um, and has always been a sort of controversial thing with the people that made the film with me because there's always a question of, well, do we need this? And that question that was a question that plagued us very far into the picture edit of like how how much of this scene should we use? Should we use this scene? I'm very happy that we did end up keeping it in its fullest form. But that was a thing we had to sort of continue to question.
And it's funny you actually bring that up because there's a couple things I actually wanted to tackle with older Kevin in particular. Um, and well, one, first, I like to give praise to the practical effects that were sprinkled throughout. Because Lord knows you speak of comedic timing, you know, stuff like that, because there wasn't just like a shot. It was a lot. It was basically just two shots, close up and then a wide. And so a lot of timing there for those of you watching and who have seen the movie. You know exactly what I'm talking about. To those who haven't, I'm not going to spoil what, but it's a very nice little opening. But without getting too much into spoilers, because I do think, let me rephrase, not what I think. I understand why people would think, why have that opening in the movie? Because for a large chunk of it, it doesn't really come back into play. But there is a moment in the apartment, which is, I think, just a little over halfway through, where you start seeing sprinkles of what that opening actually means. And then the final conversation plays a much larger role. In fact, I think what is rather interesting is despite the mystery element that is very, sprinkled throughout this film, you actually do see a very deeper theme being played out here, which is truth versus fact. And on top of that, you you do also have a little play of memory and how we choose to interpret it. And so this adds another layer to the script that I think deepens the story fully. Sure, that opening does take a while before it's paid off, but I'd like to know when you were writing this, was the theme of truth versus fact something that, you were very conscious of, or sorry, conscious of, or was this something that you didn't really know you were playing with until well after you were writing it?
So the film, the memory framing device, the film is framed as memory. We start the film with old Kevin, and we spend the rest of the movie with present day Kevin. That as a framing device existed from the first draft. But what we did with that changed a lot in the writing process. And the in its current form, it actually comes from a note that I got that I disagreed with so strongly that I almost made the movie, like I almost leaned as hard against this note as I could. Which it's funny because sometimes you get a note and it makes the film in a more obvious kind of positive way. Somebody says, "Why don't you do this?" And you think, "Oh my God, what a great idea!" And it becomes really crucial. This was the opposite, where somebody, and I want to be clear, this was not someone who had like bad intentions, but somebody read the script and had this note of, you frame this as a memory, but there's scenes that you frame this as Kevin's memory, but there's scenes that Kevin isn't in, and that doesn't make sense. And I disagreed with that note so strongly, I made the movie about it. Um, by um, and and I did that by getting into the research of it a little bit, and I read a few books about the science of memory. Um, Lisa Genova, who is a neuroscientist and who wrote the novel Still Alice, which became the Academy Award-winning film, also is also like a psychiatrist, psychologist, and wrote a couple of books about memory. And so that was particularly helpful in understanding um, the kind of scientific perspective that informs some of the way that the idea of memory is developed. In the final conversation, there's a study that's mentioned, and that study is a thing that I learned about in this book. So it's funny because it's such an essential thing for the film thematically, but it didn't arrive until I was already kind of well into the writing process. But that's how it is sometimes.
No, and it's funny you bring up that note because I feel like there was a line, or rather, there was a scene that you wrote specifically as like an answer to that line. Without giving away spoilers, let me see if I can try to recite it the best that I can. Uh, for all you know, while you two were out, she simply got on a bike and just tried it herself. And so you going, well, why did these scenes happen? If it's all from this guy's perspective, how do you know these scenes happen? And it's just a matter of that line kind of coming in and essentially filling in the blanks for you. Um, and there, I'll admit, there was one moment where it's at the apartment and it's after they had their fight where there is a certain thing that happens on screen and I remember going, oh, this is something like I'm watching this. I'm going, huh, maybe is my screener broken or something? Oh, that's part of the movie. Oh, that really got me good. And there is this level of engagement that I actually do really, really like because, like I said before, it goes back into playing with truth versus fact. And there's this, I think I used hyperrealism. That wasn't the word I was trying to use. It's a level of surrealism that does play well here. And it's only when you look at the framing device of this is a memory that the film becomes playful in a way that I think represents Danny in a very interesting way.
Mm.
And, I have, like, I know I'm throwing props left and right, but
It's
it
okay. The movie
really,
does that too.
oh my Lord. But no, it's unique. This is a very unique film, and I I love it when a movie is actively trying to get the audience and the viewer to engage with it in a very meaningful way. So, I'd like to give praise to you at least on that front, but there's always intention, and then there's always what winds up happening. Uh, I took away a lot of stuff personally from this process because with Kevin and Danny. their relationship is the core of the movie. And I have been in relationships similar to theirs, and they're always learning lessons from, from pain and from heartbreak. But I would like to know what your intent with this movie is as the writer and director. What would you like the audience to take away from it?
I hope it, I mean, I hope people are entertained, right? We didn't go for something that has a lot of that's meant to be kind of antagonistic to the viewer. Like there's a lot of films that uh try to access their effect by, by putting your audience through something. And we're not one of those movies. Like I want people to be entertained and amused. But what I hope lingers with people is this uh, inviting a kind of new understanding of which memories are important to you and to not take for granted that the way you remember them is factual. And that what's important is less what actually happened and more what you say happened. And that really is where the meaning in your memories lies. And that your memory is a kind of dialogue between um, who you are as a person and what your brain is actually able to conjure from your past. And I just hope it complicates people's relationship with what they remember and how they remember it.
And don't get me wrong, that is definitely what happened with me with certain parts of this movie because it is definitely deeply relatable uh, at certain parts. I know obsession is very, very big right now,
Mm.
but it's the same way that there's levels of impact that that movie has with a lot of people because a lot of people have been in situations that feel all too real. And if you can get even a knee-jerk reaction because you relate to something so much, I think that you're doing your job well as a filmmaker. And, once again, throwing props. You definitely managed to get me to have a couple knee-jerk reactions at several points. But as we're winding down on our conversation here, there is something that I have yet to be able to bring up, and I would like to know. You do have Janine Garofalo, who play. I can't say who she plays because that is technically a spoiler, but you do have her in the movie for a good bit of it. One, how did you sell her on the role? And two, what was it like working with her?
So I had worked with Janine as an assistant director on a film in the fall of 2024. And it was I had written this, and we I knew that the idea was that we were within a year of shooting it. And I it had not occurred to me to she had not occurred to me as a potential candidate for the role until I did this thing, and I thought that could actually be kind of amazing. Um, and I so that was sort of the genesis of that, and it was I'm trying to remember. I here again I have to give praise to Tara Rubin because she was the one who kind of got that in front of Janine and her people. Um, And when I spoke to Janine about it, she remembered me. I'm not going to say she took it because she knew me with my assistant director hat on, but I think already having some sense of who I was and a sense of, that I know a set, and she was going to be working with an experienced, fellow professional here. I think probably did help. Um, and she really, I mean, I didn't have to do a lot of selling her on it because she really loved the script. Um, and she So there wasn't I never felt like I had to sort of like talk her into anything, which is good because I would not really want to bring an actor in from that place if I could avoid it, right? Like I want them to, especially on a small film where there's you're doing it for the love of the game. um Having her, having people be there that are only really excited to be there is, I think, an important um factor in the success of your shoot. But and then as far as working with her is concerned, she it was funny because she loved the script, and then when we got on set, she would question every decision basically that the character made. Not in a aggressive or punitive or mistrustful way, just sort of I found myself kind of walking back through my writing process um repeatedly while kind of talking about it. And it improved some things about her scenes because, as we kind of step back through the decision-making process, we realized that there's a better decision available, and we that helped kind of inform the choices. She was lower take than some of the others, which is not a comment on anybody's abilities as a performer. It's just that Janine came in with an idea about how the scene should be played, and we got there pretty early on in her coverage. And so I found that I most shots I would go like 8 or 10 takes, and Janine's were mostly 3 to 5, for whatever reason or combination of reasons.
For whatever reason, we'll
Hmm.
keep it simply as that. Um, and the shooting process is never. I don't want to say it's the most difficult, but then I won't say it's the most not difficult. But for me personally, I always find the most enjoyment out of, shooting anytime I'm on a project because that's just
Yeah,
where
me too.
most of the action happens, literally. But I'd like to know, what was your favorite moment on set, if you have one, and without spoilers, obviously.
Hmm. My favorite moment. That's it, because a lot of times you get asked sort of what was the hardest moment. People don't often ask what your favorite moment was. Um, One of the best times that we had was there's this scene where Kevin gets locked out of a house and he's trying to find something, and then he has to like find a way back in. And I said to Eric, sort of go as Buster Keaton as you want to. And he goes, say less. And we had such a good time kind of calibrating the physical humor. And we didn't use all of the most sort of extreme takes, but it was such a like playful kind of moment of just seeing how silly we could get with how this character tries to solve the situation of like getting locked out of an apartment. It was a very kind of that was a very like joyful, hour and a half or so.
Because I wholeheartedly agree. Because it definitely got a little Buster Keaton, and it plays out very, very well. Because I know I definitely chuckled a little bit, but I
There is actually, sorry, there is one other thing because
oh,
I'm trying to find, because it really, so much of as it is the joy of watching the movie is just spending time with Ruby and Eric. That was such a joy for me as a director to spend time with these two characters, and I found myself after we wrapped mourning not just the experience of shooting, but I missed Ruby and Eric, but also I missed Kevin and Danny. Like I missed spending time with the fictional characters. So I'm trying to think of, and it was on their last day. The last day of the shoot was shooting the opening scene, but their Ruby and Eric's last day, it was when we were at the diner, And the two shot of them sitting at the counter, the daytime scene, um, was I was having such a good time playing with the scene there, and it was, I thought, looking so good. I really wanted to be able to just hold the two shot for the entire scene and just make that the only thing that ultimately we couldn't because it's a scene that introduces some of our non-human characters, right? Are like the wallet and the watch and like the details of that like matter and need close. Like, you can't actually tell the story only in a wide shot, but from a performance perspective, I felt like I could just keep doing the wide shot, 25 times and just get every version of it. Um, and in the end, we did cover it, and thank God for that because we needed all of those pieces in order to do it. But that was probably some of the most fun that I had was just like playing with the two of them in that scene.
And shooting for the edit is always the most one of the most practical and most important elements to do when you're actually making a movie. And yeah, every once in a while you want to let your creative juices fly, but then you're like, it's the difference between the brain and the soul, because you're just
Hmm.
like, oh man, we can do the whole thing in like a super wide. Okay, but what about the close-ups of yeah, 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 that's right. And that plays a huge part in the editing process. So I am wondering. We talked about favorite. I'm not going to talk about what was the most challenging because at this point, then this whole thing is going to become another hour. But I do want to know about the post-production process. What was that like?
That was a completely different experience. I was a very different director in post than I was in production because when I was in production, when we were shooting, I was in familiar territory in so many ways. I mean, it was because I've spent all this time as an assistant director, again, not at all saying it was easy, but it was familiar and the challenges were familiar. But when we got into post-production, I needed my hand held through a lot of the processes because I had never been through them before. And a lot of those conversations were, very technical. But I found that whereas in the shoot, I could very easily say, this idea for a shot was great, but we don't have time for it, so we're not going to do it. We're going to do a simpler version and we're going to cut it. Like leaving that on the table, leaving an idea for a shot on the table because we don't have time for it is something that I was very um, ready to do and able to do. I had a much harder time in post production accepting that there were things that we could try that our resources prevented us from trying, because you can only afford so much time with the editor because our sound design budget is only XYZ because we have to compose the entire film in the box, meaning like without live musicians. Um, and I just had a much harder time accepting that there are things that we have the material for, but the resource we don't have is time. Like that there's things that we could explore, but like that the finite thing is what we can do in post-production. I just had a much harder time accepting that. And so I think you'd have to ask my producers, but I was probably a more it was probably a more frustrating director to work with in those moments because I didn't feel comfortable leaving anything unexplored.
Well, I am hoping that your editor, who, from what I remember, is James Kodayanis, is
That's right.
that?
Yep.
I'm hoping he, one, tolerated a little bit of the shenanigans that comes with, trying to get your baby out the door, but also being able to know when to hold on something and when to let something go.
Yeah. He's wonderful and guided me very well and he also, is a friend. He's a guy I've known for a long time. It's our first time working together, but I already knew him. And that was a very good collaboration as well.
No, and that's always good to be working with either friends or people that you know. Um, and building very personal and professional relationships is a deeply intrinsic part of this industry. And it's always good to have people in your corner that you can rely on and that you can trust. Now we are coming to an end of our talk, and I just like to say, David, I very much appreciate your time with us here today, but I do have one final question.
Hmm.
And look, I know you're promoting Souvenir, and you're looking forward to having more eyes on it. For those of you watching, Details to Souvenir will be in the link in the description below. It is currently premiering at DWF. Is that where it's
Dances
currently?
with Films. Yep, in Los Angeles.
Yes. So if you're there, check it out. If not, when it releases on a wider scale, I'll be sure to link that in the description below. But one thing I love discussing with directors, other than their whole process and the experience making a movie, is what comes next. So I'd like to know, is there anything that you have down the pipeline that we should be on the lookout for, whether it be a script or another movie that's in development? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, the next film is going to be a road movie. It's the next project that I want to do is a about a man and his aging father who make competing deals with death in order to finish a road trip. And then ghosts start to show up, and it gets weird. I do want to be clear that that is also like Souvenir. That is also a comedy, but is going to lead more into kind of metaphysical uh, aspects of it. Um, I am fascinated with. I don't believe in ghosts, but I've always loved talking to people that truly believe they've had an experience with a ghost. And that's kind of brought into kind of a greater interest with that. And I want to make a movie that gives me an excuse to spend a lot of time with ghosts. Um, and I want to, the setting is very crucial to that because I want to shoot it in the northern Midwest, where I have a lot of family roots, and kind of let that be a vector into the past. Because I I've I grew up in Iowa, and in movies, the Midwest US is often kind of the butt of a joke and is seen as this place that's mostly white and mediocre and a place for mediocre people, which is number one, incredibly unfair. But number two, it also, I think there is a lack of curiosity about, the fact that like any other part of the world, this is a place people have been living. A lot of different kinds of people have been living very different kinds of lives in this place going back forever. And I want the concept of this film to kind of be an excuse to bring out some of these other stories from the past of that part of the world that don't get told as often. Um, so that's what's next.
Well, I look forward to seeing it, and I really, really hope that I enjoy it as much as Souvenir. And on that note, Mr. David Ketterer Spencer, thank you so much for stopping by on Showverse today and discussing your movie. I hope it performs well. I hope that more people get a chance to see it. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for talking.